Hi, everyone, and welcome to this OMG webinar, Where's My Data? Managing the Data Residency Challenge. Thanks for joining us today. This is Tracy Berardi. I'm Director of Program Management at the OMG, or Object Management Group, a technology standards consortium. I'm also Program Manager of the Cloud Standards Customer Council. And I'm joined today by our two presenters, Claude Boudoir, who's principal and owner of Sebe IT and Knowledge Management. He's a consultant to the OMG and is also on the steering committee of the Cloud Standards Customer Council. And Mr. Jeff Rayner, CEO of the Data Advantage Group. Jeff participated in a tutorial and roundtable discussion that we hosted on this topic at the OMG meeting in Burlingame. This was back in December. So Jeff has joined us to provide some of his perspective on these topics as well. So it's great to have both of you. In the attachments tab here on BrightTalk, we've included a PDF download of the presentation. There's also links to two discussion papers that we have published, that the OMG has published on data residency. The first is Data Residency Challenges and Opportunities for Standardization. And the second is a brand new publication just published in December, a Data Residency Maturity Model. And we'll go through these papers during the presentation and reference some of the content inside. And lastly, there's a link to the OMG Data Residency Working Group. If you would like to learn more about this effort, the folks involved, you can subscribe to our mailing list to stay current, and also get involved by participating. And Claude will explain in more detail how to do so. We'll have time for questions at the end of the presentation. So you can enter your questions in the questions tab at any time. And we should have at least 15 minutes. And yeah, that's about it for now. I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Claude to get us started. Claude, it's over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Tracy. So welcome everyone, and I'm very happy to be presenting this webinar. We've done this a few times during the history of the program. And I've had the privilege of helping steer this group since it was formed and be the lead editor for the papers we published. So we're going to go over what is data residency, how do we define it, what is the history of our work on this topic at OMG, then what types of information pose risk and what is the nature of the risks involved, and what is the landscape of laws and regulations around the world. And those three topics will be handled by Jeff. Then I'll come back and I'll talk to you about what standards exist out there and how do they relate to data residency, although as you will see, the picture is not very complete there. I will then talk about the discussion papers of the OMG, including this new deliverable, the Data Residency Maturity Model. So if you have attended any past webinars on this topic since 2016, this will be the part that is new to you. And then Tracy will come back and conclude and give you all the links and information about how to contribute to our efforts. So that's the plan for the next 40 minutes or so. Data residency definition. When we started this effort, we had to set a definition so that people with whom we communicated had an idea about what we were talking about. And we looked for definitions. There were some around, some too simple, some too complicated. And we set a definition that we actually invited people to help us refine. And as a result of this refinement, we ended with this. Data residency is a set of issues and practices related to the location of data as well as metadata, and then how you move data and metadata around locations, which means crossing the boundaries between geographies and jurisdiction, and the protection of that data or metadata against unintended access and other location-related risks. So it's a little bit maybe complicated, but it's important that metadata is also at stake, and that you're not just looking at where it is located in a state at rest, but also where is it going through when it is in movement. And we'll come back to that a little bit briefly during the presentation. So data residency isn't just where is my data, it is also what are the risks and what should I be doing in terms of protecting and managing the data when it is located or passing through various locations. Now, a lot of people think this is basically the same thing as privacy and PII, personally identifiable information, and a lot of people say, well, this is about cloud services and whether a cloud provider tells you where they're going to store the data. Well, it's a bit more complicated than that, and that is why data residency deserves its own treatment. First of all, you have different types of data that are not personally identifiable information or patient health information pose risk in certain places, as we'll see. Banking information, even if it's not about personal banking accounts, is prevented or prohibited from being located outside of the country. And you have other forms of sovereign data, such as government records, as well as data about natural resources, whether it is uranium mines or oil and gas wells, that governments consider to be sovereign data and prohibited from being stored or transferred outside of the country. So that's a bit more complicated than just PII. Therefore, data residency is broader than privacy. Secondly, you have all sorts of other IT services or corporate practices other than cloud computing that also put the data at risk. It could be traditional data center hosting. It could simply be a remote help desk that can view some of the data as they provide assistance to users. So the range of practices in contracting and using IT resources that exposes data to issues related to residency is broader than cloud computing. So how have we been handling this? What's the history of our work? There was a member of the object management group who actually made the initial request practically 3 years ago, at which point the OMG assembled a group of people to think about this issue and see how relevant it was to the work of the object management group. And we started that effort in June 2015. Coincidentally, we assembled in Berlin on the day of June, which is the day the first draft of what was to become the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, was leaked to the press and causing a big outcry of people saying, if this regulation sees the light of day in its current form, it's going to kill not IT services, but cloud offerings in Europe. That was maybe a bit of an extreme reaction, but it was interesting that as we sat around the table that morning, this was the key news item in the IT world, and that certainly made us feel justified in addressing this topic. We've then continued to have a meeting of some sort every quarter since then, and the first few meetings were devoted to preparing and issuing a request for information, or RFI, in order to understand who was interested in this topic, how they were managing data residency, and what were the things that the OMG could do to help people. We issued the RFI, we processed the results we received, digested them, synthesized them, and then decided that the first deliverable should be a discussion paper capturing everything we had learned and not just the challenges, but also what might be opportunities for standardization, since that's what the OMG does, is create standard specifications to help the industry address problems in a consistent way. We went through several rounds of drafting and editing the discussion paper. We enlisted the help of the Cloud Standards Customer Council, CSCC. As I said, data residency is not just about the cloud, but clearly cloud services plays an important role in making the location of data somewhat uncertain for the data owner. So we collaborated and we issued two separate but almost identical papers in April and May 2017, so less than a year ago. The differences between the papers are not only the cover page that follows the branding of each organization, but there is a discussion about what we could do about standardization that is relevant to the OMG paper, but is not relevant to the Cloud Standards Customer Council because it doesn't define standards, it just provides guidance to users. So there is a section of the two papers that is somewhat different in tone and intent based on that, but the papers are like 80+% identical otherwise. So the papers, as I said, were released at the very beginning of the second quarter last year, and we did all the marketing around it. Then we switched to creating and teaching tutorials based on all this material. So we've done it already 3 times in June, September, and December. I will do it again in a few weeks in Western Virginia during our next meeting. And then we switched to an item that was suggested during the course of last year, which is to provide guidance in the form of a maturity model, which I will present to you later. So that's the history of the effort. And in 2018, we're going to switch gears again a little bit and try to work with other people who are worried about data governance and see if we can merge the effort on data residency into a slightly more complete framework for information governance. So I'm now handing the presenter's baton to Jeff to start talking about risks.
Thanks so much, Claude. Hi, everyone. So when we talk about sources of risk, they can vary depending on the laws and regulations we see across countries and jurisdictions. You know, the most widely talked about, of course, are things like personal identifiable information and patient health information, for example. But obviously, we also have our own corporate proprietary information, or potentially we may have proprietary information of our corporate partners that we have legal and responsibilities over. We also see things like communication, such as email or messaging systems, right, as well as voicemail systems. We see things like government information, that is including things like military information where, you know, just recently, for example, there was a case where people were wearing, soldiers are wearing their Fitbits and publishing online their exercise routines, which allowed people to understand where they were at any given time and where they were deployed, right? So there can be a lot of subtle things that could cause problems in those cases. But also things like the ability to understand natural resources and banking records. And with a lot of this, there's also jurisdictions that are making both requiring certain amounts of encryption for this data, and not only where it's housed, but how it's encrypted, and in other cases requiring maximum levels of encryption, where certain authorities want to have access to certain types of personally identifiable information about certain types of users, maybe of systems, and want to make sure that's going to be accessible to them if there's some need for it from their perspective. Right? We also see owners of data trying to understand where they can locate data to improve the efficiency of their operations, but not necessarily understanding the implications of that, because each jurisdiction often has specific regulations around the housing of that data. Some of those laws can even be conflicting, right? And where different jurisdictions essentially want to have access to information for their own uses, right? Especially government organizations, right? And so it's a tricky problem for the organizations trying to support this. How can they deal with driving efficiency in their organization when they're not able to necessarily collect all that information in an efficient way, right? And then in some cases, some organizations may just not be aware of what data they even house, right? They may be getting data from partners or collecting data, and some of that may be core to their business processes, but there may be ancillary data that comes with that, right? And a lot of that depends on their own business processes and how mature they are, and making sure they identify that data and any potential regulations or risks that may be involved with the storage and management of that data, right? And then, of course, companies over time often go through mergers and acquisitions, and this will expose them to new jurisdictions that they have to worry about from a process perspective. And as the Internet of Things is evolving, we're seeing more and more collection of information, like that example with the Fitbit, where you may unintentionally be providing information that's sensitive in nature, and at first blush, you wouldn't really be thinking about that, because some of the, obviously someone who's running a fitness company is not worried about necessarily at the top of their mind, national defense. Right? So, but you really have to think outside the box about how that information essentially can be consumed by potentially nefarious folks, right? Or people who can leverage that information in ways it might not have necessarily been intended for, but may have application to, right? And, unfortunately, a lot of the laws that are developing are really focused on, you're essentially guilty until you prove that you're innocent, right? So you have to be very careful with these things. And so when we look at the nature of the risks, we have different, it's essentially driving higher costs as it kind of makes it more difficult for the consolidation of data in standardized ways. So we might have to have redundant data centers in certain jurisdictions to store data. We might have to store encryption keys or have separate encryption keys per jurisdiction, where authorities might want to have access to those encryption keys, for example. You might have, you have to install new additional processes in order to govern the movement of data across jurisdictions, right? And you're also causing problems with, as you back up data, where those backups are going to be stored. Often they're stored off-site. Where that source is, where that actual location is, does matter, right? And then also the life cycle management of those backups over time. And obviously today there are lots of monetary risks with this, especially with the introductions of things like GDPR in Europe. But there's a huge reputational risk with all this as well, right? So inevitably, if data does get compromised in some way, often that becomes front page news and can cause, reputational risk for the organization, right? So we're now seeing many different data residency laws and regulations coming into play. For better or worse, the motivation for these laws will vary, whether some jurisdictions are making sure they're trying to protect essentially what they view as the consumers in those jurisdictions and keeping data within those jurisdictions so that they have legal capabilities to enforce regulations and rules, or in other cases where governments are doing that mainly for security reasons, for example. And the penalties being applied vary pretty dramatically depending on the jurisdiction and the rules. And the most prominent of that is certainly today is probably the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe that goes in effect in May. And that's quite comprehensive and has very punitive fines associated with it as a percentage of your revenue. So it's really could be quite large. And a lot of the motivations are being driven by both to protect citizens, but also to protect the ability for governments to enforce things like tax laws or security laws, and to understand how data and its monetization across borders, right? So today, we have a proliferation of laws across different jurisdictions. So this is kind of a little bit of a synopsis that's taken out of the one of the original requirements documentations that we did around this concept, where there's been kind of an audit of the high-level rules that are both in effect today as well as have been proposed or are coming into effect in the near term. This is a really nice high-level overview of some of the regulations that might be relevant depending on your organization and where it operates. So I highly recommend you take a look at that and kind of read that in a little bit more detail. But you have several different jurisdictions working in often in cross currents as far as how they're trying to regulate the flow of data across their borders, and to make sure that various types of sovereigns have access to the data that they need for various security purposes as they deem it. Okay. And now I'm going to hand it back over to Claude.
Thank you, Jeff. So we have, didn't want to do duplicate work at the OMG, that all these issues. Surely there must be already standards that, even if they don't call it data residency, cover this issue of how do you manage data location. And we found that actually there was essentially nothing. I mean, there's obviously a certain number of standards that cover security. There's a few that cover issues related to privacy, either as part of security or separately. But the question of how do you describe what you can or cannot do with your data in terms of its location, there was nothing directly addressed in those areas by the standards. So we found that there are aspects of the following things or the following documents that do relate indirectly. So there's several publications from the National Institutes for Standards and Technology, NIST, and I've listed 3 here. in the 800 series, the 500 series, and then NIST report 1500 that talk about it, but again, somewhat indirectly. The main ISO IEC standards on security, which is of course 27001 with 27002, which is its companion about the practices, and then 27017 and 18, which are oriented specifically to how those security standards adapt to the cloud or apply to the cloud. Those have certain implications, again, related to data residency, in particular the 17 and 18 ones, because they address cloud services, but they don't address other aspects of IT services that might be executed remotely, such as data hosting or remote help desks that would also create risks. There is a big data standards from NIST that has some relevance. The Cloud Security Alliance, CSA, formed last year an International Standardization Council, ISC, and these issues are on the table, so to speak. They're part of the scope they want to address, but they're just starting their work. We were told by one of the members of our group, a major IT services company, that there is a subcommittee of ISO IEC JTC1, which was at the time considering work on data residency and was actually interested to hear that we were working on it at OMG and had mentioned the possibility of working together and leveraging what we had done. And we've actually not heard from them since then, even though we did some outreach at some point and tried to go through the same common contact and say, hey, shall we meet to discuss what we've done? But it doesn't look like their work has advanced very much. And those of you who have worked on ISO committees, etc., know that it can be a long, drawn process because everything needs, approval from all the member countries, and etc. So it takes a while to get started, and it also takes a while to get concluded. In the meantime, the work can progress quite nicely, but I don't think we're there yet. And then, interestingly, the cloud providers based in Europe, people like OEH and some others, have tried to take the lead in a collaborative way in fending off the regulatory inclinations of the countries where they work by putting forward a voluntary data protection code. So again, this is more about protecting personal information. It doesn't really refer to the other forms of protected or sovereign data, but they're trying to say if we put in place some reasonable limitations on ourselves, if we make some reasonable commitments not to do bad things, maybe we'll avoid governments passing laws and regulations that are stricter than even what is in the General Data Protection Regulation. And the GDPR, of course, create problems for the data owners as well as for the cloud providers, but the cloud providers are trying to be proactive about helping people avoid those risks and, of course, avoiding those risks for themselves. But as most voluntary data protection codes, it is likely that the regulators will probably at some point find that these do not go far enough. So that's the landscape. It's very incomplete, as you can see. And there's enough things that we've done at OMG before, like the information exchange framework. There's also some work going on in the military community about a data tagging and labeling framework to identify data that belongs to certain governments. And those efforts are relevant. but those standards are either being considered or are not really fully deployed yet, and therefore the situation is still incomplete even when we take these efforts into account. So the first discussion paper, which we published in April, was approved at the end of March and published in April. You can see here those two cover pages, the one from the OMG, the one from the CSCC. On the right-hand side, you have the table of contents of the OMG version, and there's, I know it's an eye chart right now, but when you download the full paper, which is, you have the link in the attachments and links section of this presentation on the right-hand side in the accordion of submenus there, you will be able to obviously read the whole paper. The table of content is essentially the same, except that the section on what could we do in terms of standards is different. It's section 6 of the paper. In the OMG paper, it's called Potential OMG Roadmap for Data Residency Standards. In the CSCC paper, it's basically called something different. I think it's something like, end user needs for standards. So it takes a different perspective, that of the end users, as opposed to that of the standards writers. Other than that, the papers, as I said, are the same. They're about 35 pages each. So depending on your perspective, you can download one or the other. And the link that we provided is the link to the OMG version. So that's the coverage. And now we come to the latest piece of work we've done, which is the Data Residency Maturity Model. So first of all, I will say that we consider this to be an initial version. Most OMG publications go through revisions over time. For standards, of course, these are extremely formal revisions that have an impact on the companies that supply tools and on the users that follow those standards, because changes need to be forward compatible, etc. For a discussion paper, the rules would be much less stringent, but there was some discussion, obviously, of this model before it was adopted, and there can still be discussion now. It is not set in stone. If we need to update it, we will update it. Now, so the paper was issued in December, was approved in early December, publicized later. By the way, OMG calls these things discussion papers. Most other organizations would call them white papers, but it's the same concept. And we've as I said, it's a first stage. It's better than a draft, but not a full-fledged standard. It's not something that anyone who would want to adopt it would have to adopt without making any adaptation. It's more flexible than that. And we are actually eager, if any of the people on this call work for organizations that are interested in adopting or adapting it, talk to us, because there's certainly room to collaborate here, make it better, republish it, and make it available or discuss it with you in more detail. The paper, of course, is more than just the chart you see on this slide. This slide, or the table on the right-hand side, is the core, if you want, of the actual discussion paper. It's a short paper. It's 6 or 7 pages, maybe 9 with references in the cover page, but no more than that. And the central piece of work is this table, but there are all sorts of text surrounding that to explain how is this model structured and how you use it. So it is structured in the same manner as the original Software Engineering Institute's Capability Maturity Model for Software Engineering, the very famous CMM, which was published by SEI at Carnegie Mellon University in 1990 by a number of people, including Bill Curtis, whose leads one of the other OMG entities or programs, the Center for IT Software Quality. This CMM model has proven its value over time. You know, the general structure has been here now for 28 years and has been used in a bunch of other areas, including security. So we went back to this model and we said, how can we adapt this to describe how an organization becomes better over time at handling data residency? And we went back to the original definitions of the 5 levels of maturity. You can see them ranked from bottom to top, number 1 through 5, and they're named initial, repeatable, defined, managed, and optimizing levels of maturity. It's important to note, if you're not familiar with CMMs, with capability maturity models, that the highest level, number 5, is called optimizing. It's not called optimized. And the reason for that is because when you're in the optimizing mode, you're in a continuous evolution and improvement process. So this is sort of the Deming quality circles idea of continuous improvement. Therefore, you're never optimized, which would imply that the journey ends. You're in this endless journey where you're constantly optimizing what you do. The column after the names, the third column from the left of the table, the ones that shaded a little bit in a sort of slightly pinkish color, is basically a textual description of what those levels mean. And the bulleted points on the right-hand side are called key process areas, or KPAs. They're indications of what are the practices that need to be in place and executed regularly so that an organization can claim to be at that level. So at the bottom right, you don't need to do anything because the bottom level, initial level, is sort of the so-called sometimes chaotic level, or the official name is initial, but people sort of derisively call it the chaotic level, which is that nothing is in place. So this is a level at which an organization might completely ignore the fact that its data may be located in a place that creates a risk, and therefore they're going to be surprised when there is an issue, when they lose data, or when that data is impounded or requested by a foreign government, or when that data leaks because you don't have the necessary protections in that country, etc., etc. Or when they get fined because of such a breach. Then at the repeatable level, you have a certain number of practices that includes executive awareness and a certain number of informal practices and guidelines. And the reason the organization's execution of its data management is so-called repeatable is because there are some informal processes, such as mentoring and teaching of junior employees by more senior ones, etc., so that every time the question arises, where do we put that data, there's at least some practices that there's something gets done on a repeatable basis, although it's not formally defined well. And so the worst problems are typically avoided, but this relies on the heroics or the initiative of specific employees who know about it, care about it, and are willing to work the extra hours to fix problems as soon as they arise, or preferably before they arise. So there's no assurance that the process will always work well, but at least there is a certain evidence that in general things are being handled more in a seat of the pants manner than anything else. Level 3 is the defined level, and that means that basically things are documented. It implies more involvement by management and by employees, and it means that all the processes are formally documented. It also means basically that an organization has models of its information. So there's a taxonomy of sensitive data, for instance. The organization formally defines what are the kinds of data that it manages that need to be protected, which kinds of data need to remain in-house, which kinds of data contain information that comes from various countries, and therefore it's impossible for that data to all be stored in one country and not pose a problem. There's some formal management and assignment of people to play specific roles about the data. So data steward, data custodian, etc. And the organization has defined in writing what the procedures and processes and internal standards are to do that. Now, that does not mean that the management processes are reliable, and there's more KPAs, key process areas, that need to be implemented in order to get to the managed level, number 4. At the managed level, the main concept is you have accountability and you basically have a RACI matrix, so a responsibility assignment matrix. RACI means responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. So that means that basically there's governance. There may be a steering committee, there may be an executive specifically in charge, there may be a working group that includes legal, compliance, finance, lines of business, and IT. There's formal policies with certain measures associated with those policies to enforce them. When people model information, whether it is as an overall information architecture effort or whether it is for the purpose of documenting the requirements for a single application, there's rules about the fact that you decide and you document in that information model where data can or cannot be stored. It also means that you monitor what's going on in terms of logging and creating an audit trail of where data has been moved and stored. The employee training program is formal, which means that there is a record that's kept of who has been trained. Did they pass the tests at the end of the training? Do they have to retake the training? How often do they have to get a refresher on the training, etc.? The sort of same things that most organizations are now doing about security needs to be put in place for data residency. And finally, the optimizing level, since we're talking about continuous improvement at that level, it means that you have metrics about data residency. It could be frequency of incidents. It could be what amounts of data are stored where. And there's an active data gathering and review process to make sure that this remains compliant. And there's also a process of regularly revising and watching for changes that could cause the data residency policies of the organization to become obsolete and to require updating. So there's multiple sources that require this continuous improvement. The nature of the business may change. The requirements of the business may change. There could be acquisitions or divestitures, as Jeff mentioned earlier, that require that the policies change or that the data location change. Someone may suddenly add a new field to a database, and that field is more sensitive than the data that was there before. So the data residency constraints may suddenly get increased or made more severe simply because someone decided, oh, we're going to add this piece of data in the next version of such and such database. The technology changes. So obviously, if someone finds a way to break a certain strength of encryption keys, suddenly the way data is encrypted in order to be protected from unintended access is going to need to be updated. And then, of course, the laws and regulations themselves. You saw earlier in the very colorful chart that Jeff presented, the complexity of the laws and regulations that existed around the world. Many of these laws and regulations are still in flux, and many countries that don't have a lot of them are considering them right now. So it's important to watch that, given that there are 200 countries in the world, give or take a few, and that you have a lot of regional regulations, trade compliance regulations, etc. My guess is that there's probably anywhere between 400 and 500 texts that might apply depending where you do work. So it is a significant challenge to stay abreast of what's going on in this field. So these are the practices. There's 20 bullets in that right column in total. So there's 5 level, 20 key process areas, and these 20 KPIs are what we hope provides guidance to organizations to make sure they stay compliant or that they avoid this. So, and of course, you know, even though I spent quite a bit of time on this slide, it's clear that you've got to study it and the accompanying text more carefully in the document. So what should you do with this information? Well, first of all, you can participate in our working group because it's a continuing process. We're going to revise documents and we're going to decide what to do next. You should review the papers. The links are here on the slide, but you can also see them in the attachment and links bar on the right-hand side of your screen. You certainly could consider adopting the maturity model, potentially adapt it to your organization. So whether you're a consulting firm, a cloud company, an end user, you may want to take this document and use it. If you are an organization that has influence over what other people do, you may want to collaborate with us to give this document broader recognition. So, you know, if there are NIST people on the call, for instance, would you want to make it into a NIST special publication? Of course, you don't have to take it verbatim the way it is. We'd offer it to you as a starting point, and then we can work together on making it better before you adopt it and republish it. We want to know about applicable standards that we may have missed or standards work in progress. We also want to influence the work of other organizations developing standards so that they take data residency into account. Our current intent in our next meetings is there are several other efforts in the OMG that have something to do with the handling of data. So we will discuss just less than a month from now, in about 3 weeks when we meet in Virginia, we're going to discuss whether we can unify these efforts under a single sort of data governance moniker. And then the priority that we discussed at our last meetings is to formalize the description of laws and regulations using some sort of mechanism that might be similar to another OMG standard called the semantics of business value and business rules, and see if we could do a semantics of data residency rules and laws that would help remove the ambiguities inherent to the fact that these laws and regulations are all written in natural languages. So this is what we have on our roadmap for this year. So I'm going to let Tracy finish and lead the question session.
Great. Thanks, Claude. And thank you, Jeff, too. This is Tracy, back to me. And now is a great time. If you have questions, you can enter them in the questions tab here on Bright Talk. Thank you for tuning in today. We do have a mailing list here at the OMG where we send updates, you know, as we publish new papers, work on new projects, highlight some things happening in the news. I'm sure you've been tracking the Microsoft case If you would like to subscribe to this list, you can send an email to request@omg.org and ask to be added to the data residency list, and we'll subscribe you to that list. The Object Management Group also hosts a members meeting. This happens quarterly, and our next big meeting, these are week-long meetings. It's the week of March 19th to 23rd in Reston, Virginia, and the OMG Data Residency Working Group will be meeting in some capacity at each meeting. So you see the next one, March 20th, that's a Tuesday in Reston. We're hosting a complimentary tutorial and roundtable from 9 to 12. You're welcome to join us for lunch from 12 to 1, and then we'll have more of a working group session in the afternoon. Then the next OMG meeting is the week of June 18th to 22nd in Boston, and we'll have plans for that soon. And then September will be in Ottawa, the week of September 24th to 28th. We're planning a two-day event for the Canadian government to expose them to some key OMG standard specifications, and data residency will be one of the talks that we give. You can find more information on these events at omg.org. We have an event calendar. And of course, you're welcome to email me at any point in time, tracy@omg.org. My email is here. Also on the title slide of our webinar presentation is Claude's email and Jeff's email. We'd be happy to chat with you following presentation. But now let's take a couple of questions. Let's see. And Claude and Jeff, you can probably see this too in our questions box.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
The question is about whether the various alternatives about cloud, whether it is branded alternatives, the questioner listed them there, or whether it's the choice between IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS, infrastructure platform, or software as a service, whether that has an implication on how we see the issue. Absolutely, in terms of who's responsible for what. So it's a great question because, indeed, a cloud provider of infrastructure as a service is basically providing bare metal and perhaps the operating system and letting the customer do what the customer wants. Therefore, it is fairly easy for the cloud provider to say, we have no idea what is the data that is stored on there. Therefore, that's not our problem. We have essentially plausible deniability that there is an issue, and it is entirely our customer's problem. And that's legitimate. On the other hand, at the opposite end of the spectrum, if someone provides software as a service, let's take Salesforce, the poster boy for SaaS, because they started so early. It is impossible for Salesforce to say, oh, we had no idea that you were storing phone numbers on there, because this is a CRM application. By definition, it is storing personal contact information for clients. So there is a different situation there, and the recommendation to the end users is you have to be very careful in the cloud services agreement that the roles and responsibilities are well defined, and usually the cloud provider will tell to the client, you identify us, you hold us harmless, and if there's a problem, it's yours, not ours. And in some cases, it's acceptable. In other cases, you may need to negotiate some interim measures, including the fact that the cloud provider needs to tell you when they move the data from one country to another. So yes, there is a difference, but regardless, it's something you need to move into with your eyes open.
Great, thanks, Claude. And Jeff, of course, feel free to chime in if you have anything to add. There's, it is funny, a little note here to me. Tracy, make sure to tell people on the line that we OMGers are really quite friendly, and we are. And there's another question, must a person be a member of the OMG to join the working group or to attend one of the quarterly meetings? All great questions. So you do not need to be a member organization of the OMG to join this working group. You're welcome to start participating. Just visit omg.org/data residency, and there's a contact there. We can help you get integrated into our working group. And to attend a meeting, so there are working group sessions during the member meetings that are members only, but we do invite folks from outside to join. And then the special events, which are a little different than the working group meetings, those are open to the public. And so far we've held special events on data residency, so you're very welcome to join in either capacity. We'd really like to have you. Just know that when we go into a working group session, it typically is member organizations, but we love guests. So yes, just contact us if you're interested in participating.
The only penalty you have to pay if you're not a member is you're going to be wearing a green badge instead of a white badge, and so you can expect people to stop you in the hallway and say, "Hi, who are you? Welcome here," and to basically all become a little bit of marketeers for on behalf of the OMG and repeatedly ask you, when are you going to join? So there's subtle pressure, but we're friendly people. We'll accept you.
Next question is the data residency group intending to address data loss prevention as part of the CMM, perhaps in the context of international harmonization of regulations and frameworks?
Jeff, I heard you catch your breath. Do you want to answer that one? Okay, if Jeff doesn't do it, let me say the following.
Sorry,
you were on mute. Yeah. Do you have an opinion on this, Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, I think that would certainly be within scope. I mean, I think it's important to look at this holistically across all the different ways that you would steward data, right? There's no sense having separate processes that are outside that scope. So I think that's what Claude had mentioned earlier too, is trying to integrate this more with the other governance frameworks that are underway at the OMG as well, and that certainly I think makes sense long term. So, Claude, would you want to add to that? Or?
No, I think, as I said, our work is work in progress. We can update things. We can write additional discussion papers to complement previous ones. We can revise them. The topics we address are somewhat constrained by the, competencies and experience of the people in the working groups. So we welcome more suggestions about how to handle this topic, either face-to-face if the questioner can come to one of our meetings, or simply by email at one of the addresses that have been mentioned, and we'll engage in a discussion and we'll see how we need to handle this topic.
And Claude and Jeff, just the last question here, and we're right on time. Who's been involved in this work so far? Maybe you can give just a quick overview of that.
Well, I'm the guy who has the whole history, so it's going to be my turn to answer that one again. So we've had a bunch of companies involved, mostly through the process of issuing the initial request for information 2 years ago, and so we've had several large IT service providers who have chosen, in some cases, not to be named explicitly in the discussion paper, simply because their business is at stake if they have any accidents related to data residency. So they were a little bit shy about it. But let me swear to you that some really major companies were there. We had research institutes like the Fraunhofer Institute in Germany. We had several companies that provide large-scale databases that can be managed internationally. And then in the successive meetings after that, we've had consultants from the US and Canada. We've had, for instance, Mike Abramson has been a member of our group, and he works for ASMG in Ottawa and is represented to us the inputs and interests of people in Canada who often have the issue that their data ends up being stored in the U.S. We've had people, of course, like Jeff, who's on the call right now, who's with Data Advantage, another Canadian consultant, a British consultant, a Dutch company also. We had people representing at least one person representing the oil and gas industry, consultant with lots of years of history in the oil and gas services business and petroleum data management, which is a type of data that is often considered sovereign data by the respective governments. And then, well, I mean, the total list sort of escapes my mind a little bit, but we've had a fair amount of diversified representation from industry, academia, government, and IT service providers.
Thanks, Claude. You're always so thorough. And thank you,
Sometimes
Jeff,
too much.
and for everyone who joined us today. This presentation will be available on demand, right after we close here on Bright Talk, as well as on the OMG and Cloud Standards Customer Council websites. We hope to see you on a future webinar and contact us. We'd love to chat with you. Everyone have a nice day. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.